It wasn't the car in the driveway that first unsettled me. It was the sunlight streaming through the living room window, catching on something odd. I hadn't expected to be home this early. My business trip was supposed to last until tomorrow, but an earlier flight meant I had the chance to surprise Jessica. After 7 years of marriage, surprises felt important. I parked on the street, just out of sight, thinking the quiet would work in my favor. If she was napping, I could slip into bed next to her. Maybe we'd laugh about it, make a day out of it. As I stepped closer to the house, I noticed the blinds were closed. Jessica never closed them during the day. She loved the sunlight. Natural light is good for the soul, she'd always say. Today, though, the house was almost hermetically sealed. An unsettling contrast to the vibrant home I'd left a few days ago. I entered quietly, keys in hand, already sensing something wasn't right. The air felt charged. Not in the way it did after an argument, but something worse, a tension I couldn't yet explain. I moved further in, past the kitchen and toward the staircase, when I noticed something glittering faintly in the hallway. I bent down, narrowing my eyes as I picked up a small, circular object from the floor. It was foil, the kind that came from pill strips. Jessica wasn't on any medication. At least, she wasn't supposed to be. I stared at the tiny circle of foil in my hand, my mind racing through possibilities. My heart started pounding in my chest, louder than the usual paranoia that creeps in when things don't seem quite right. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe I just hadn't noticed her taking something. Maybe she had started birth control again for hormonal reasons. But the truth gnawed at me. The truth I had been avoiding for months. As I took another step, I noticed something else. The scent. Faint but unmistakable, cologne. Not mine. It lingered in the air, mixing with Jessica's perfume, creating a scent that was nauseatingly intimate. My head felt like it was filling with fog. I moved up the stairs, careful to avoid making any sound. Jessica's laughter floated down, soft, playful, and not meant for me. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard her use in months. My grip tightened on the stair railing as I reached the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the narrow crack, I could see shadows moving, subtle and slow. I took a deep breath, leaning against the wall, trying to steady myself, but my pulse quickened with every muffled word I heard from the room. I pushed the door open just enough to see them. There she was, lying in our bed, the sheets half covering her body. Beside her, a man, shirtless, his hand casually tracing the curve of her waist. They were facing each other, their smiles effortless, their closeness unbearably familiar. I stood there, frozen in place, while my world shattered in an instant. Jessica had never looked so content, so free of the tension that had defined our marriage for the last year. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt the most. It was the realization that I had been blind to it for so long. The unspoken distance, the nights she claimed to be too tired, the way she angled her phone away from me when she texted. It all made sense now, too late for me to do anything but watch as my life unraveled in front of me. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to storm in and throw him out. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe I wasn't ready to face the full extent of her betrayal. I turned around and made my way back downstairs, careful not to make a sound, leaving them in their moment of stolen happiness. I didn't confront her that day. Instead, I grabbed my keys, left the house, and drove aimlessly for hours. My mind kept going back to the foil on the floor, that tiny scrap of evidence that my wife had been living a secret life. The first crack in the illusion of perfection. The beginning of the end. I drove in a daze, my mind replaying the scene in the bedroom like a broken film reel. Each loop of that memory tore at me, making it harder to breathe. Jessica, her body pressed close to him, her laughter filling the room that was supposed to be ours. I could still hear it echoing in my head. That carefree laugh, the one she hadn't used around me for months. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away. The steering wheel trembled under my grip, my knuckles turning white as I fought the urge to scream, to smash something, anything. How long had this been going on? How many nights had she smiled that way with him while I was out of town, working hard to provide for us? After what felt like hours, I pulled into a parking lot near the park where we used to walk together. The place where we dreamed of building a future, where we talked about having kids someday. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting alone in a place filled with memories of us, while she was at home with him. The thought made my stomach churn. I took out my phone, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through the endless string of text messages between us. Most were about mundane things. Don't forget to pick up milk, or I'll be late tonight. But looking at them now, I realized how hollow those conversations had become. It was as if we were living separate lives, communicating only because it was expected, not because we actually wanted to. I clicked on Jessica's name and stared at our last exchange. She had sent me a text earlier in the day. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Miss you, Red Heart. The message felt like a slap in the face now. How could she say she missed me while lying next to another man? How could she pretend everything was normal? My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How did she meet him? Was this just a fling, or something deeper? I didn't want to know, but at the same time, I had to know. I had to understand how the woman I loved had become a stranger. I opened her social media, scrolling through her photos, looking for any hint of him. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Jessica had always been careful about her online presence, keeping her private life just that, private. But there were little signs that seemed so obvious now. The photos of her at dinner with friends, the weekends where she said she was catching up on work, or spending time with her sister. Was it all a lie? I slumped back in the seat, the weight of everything pressing down on me. How could I have been so blind? How could I not see what was happening right in front of me? The signs were there. I just hadn't wanted to believe them. I had convinced myself that the distance between us was normal, that she was just stressed, that we would eventually find our way back to each other. But now I knew the truth. She had already found someone else, and I was the fool who had let it happen. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind a whirlpool of rage, confusion, and pain. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park. I couldn't go home. Not yet. The thought of seeing them together again was unbearable. I needed a plan. The next morning, I returned home, careful to park down the street so they wouldn't hear me. I wasn't ready to confront Jessica. I wasn't even sure what I'd say when the moment came. But I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof that would make her face what she had done. The house was quiet when I entered. No laughter this time. No voices. It was as if nothing had happened. Jessica's car was still in the driveway, and the black sedan was gone. I walked through the front door, my senses on high alert, listening for any signs of movement. But all I could hear was the ticking of the kitchen clock. I went upstairs to our bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The bed had been made, the sheets freshly tucked in as if to erase the evidence of last night. But I knew better. I could still feel their presence in the room, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, to keep my emotions in check. There was nothing outwardly incriminating. No misplaced clothes, no stray belongings. Just the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, mocking me with its familiarity. I felt like I was walking through a crime scene, trying to piece together what had happened while I was gone. I headed to her closet, my hands trembling as I opened the doors. Inside, everything looked perfectly normal. Dresses hung in neat rows, shoes lined up along the bottom. But something caught my eye, a small, sleek box tucked away at the back. It was the kind of thing I had never seen before. I pulled it out slowly, my mind racing with possibilities. The box was unmarked, except for a tiny logo on the corner. I opened it, and inside was a sleek phone. A second phone, one I'd never seen her use before. My hands began to shake as I powered it on, praying I could crack the password. I tried her birthday, then our anniversary. Nothing. I was about to give up when I thought of something. The date we first met. I entered it, and the screen unlocked. My heart sank as I scrolled through the messages. There were dozens of them, all from the same number. I didn't recognize the name saved in her contacts, Ryan, but the content was unmistakable. They'd been meeting for months, exchanging texts filled with inside jokes, intimate plans, and promises of secret weekends away. My blood boiled as I realized that while I had been planning a romantic getaway for our anniversary, she had been planning her own with him. One message, in particular, stood out. I can't wait to see you again. Last night was incredible. He's so clueless. I think he's starting to suspect, but it's kind of exciting, keeping this from him. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. The woman I thought I knew was laughing behind my back, enjoying the thrill of deceiving me. I dropped the phone, the betrayal now real in a way it hadn't been before. She had mocked me, lied to me, and built an entire life with someone else right under my nose. This wasn't just a fling. This was calculated, planned. And now, I had the proof. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, replaying the messages in my head, the weight of her deceit crushing me with every passing hour. By the time Jessica came home that evening, I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't going to play the role of the oblivious husband. She walked in, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "Hey, you're home early," she said, dropping her purse on the counter. I watched her carefully, noting the way she avoided looking directly at me, the subtle tension in her voice. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I thought it was time we had a talk." Her smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly recovered, pulling out a bottle of wine from the cabinet. "Sure, what's up?" she asked casually, as if we were about to discuss dinner plans or weekend getaways. I let the silence hang between us for a moment before I spoke again, my voice lower this time. "I found your other phone." Jessica froze, the bottle slipping slightly in her grip. Her eyes widened, just for a split second, before she composed herself. She turned to face me, her expression a mixture of confusion and innocence. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the phone out of my pocket, holding it up for her to see. "This, your second phone, the one you've been using to message Ryan." Her face paled, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she stared at me, the facade of our perfect marriage crumbling in front of us. "You're going to explain everything, Jessica," I said, my voice cold, "or I'm walking out that door for good." Jessica stared at the phone in my hand, her face drained of all color. I could see her mind racing, trying to come up with a story to save herself. But there was no escaping it now. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to let her slither away with excuses. I stood there, waiting for her to speak, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "Who's Ryan?" I demanded, my voice sharp, each word a cut. Her eyes darted from the phone to me, her lips parting slightly, but no sound came out. Then, she swallowed hard, placing the bottle of wine on the counter with trembling hands. The woman I had known, calm, composed, always in control, was gone. All that was left was someone scrambling to save herself. "Jake, please," she whispered. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped. "Jessica, I'm not an idiot. I saw the messages. I saw what you've been doing. How long? How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been with him?" Her face crumpled, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, but they didn't stir any sympathy in me. Not anymore. They weren't tears of regret. They were tears of getting caught. It just happened," she stammered. "I didn't mean for it to. Jake, I'm so sorry. How long, Jessica?" I cut her off, my voice shaking with anger. "Tell me the truth." She blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears from falling. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she finally answered, her voice barely audible. 6 months. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. 6 months. Half a year of betrayal, of lies, of playing the role of a loving wife while sneaking around behind my back. I clenched my fists, my entire body trembling with rage. How many nights had I sat at the dinner table, talking about work, about life, about us, while she was thinking about him? How many lies had she told, looking me straight in the eyes? 6 months, I repeated, my voice hollow. "And you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think to stop?" "I tried, Jake. I tried to end it," she said, stepping toward me, her voice desperate now. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you." "Too late for that," I muttered bitterly. "You didn't want to hurt me? What do you think this is?" She reached for me, but I stepped back, the betrayal too fresh, too raw for any sort of physical contact. "Jake, please," she begged. "It was a mistake." I love you. I do. This was a stupid, terrible mistake. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? I repeated, my voice rising. You threw away 7 years of marriage for nothing? You risked everything for nothing? She shook her head frantically, wiping at her tears. I was lost. I was confused. Ryan. He was just there. He made me feel. Don't you dare. I interrupted, my voice trembling with fury. Don't you dare blame this on some feeling he gave you. You had a choice, Jessica. You chose this. You chose to betray me. You chose to destroy everything we built. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But her tears didn't move me. All I could feel was a deep, suffocating sense of loss, like everything I had believed in, everything I had trusted, was slipping away from me. I turned away, trying to catch my breath. I needed space, distance. I needed to think. But all I could hear was her sobbing behind me, her cries of, "I'm sorry," echoing in the house that once felt like home but now felt like a prison. The days following Jessica's confession were a blur. I didn't stay at the house that night. I couldn't. I packed a bag and left without saying another word, unable to bear her presence any longer. I needed space to process, to think about what to do next. I checked into a small motel on the other side of town, far away from the life I thought I knew. But even in that dingy room, the memories haunted me. I could still see her with him, still hear her laughter, carefree and joyful in a way it hadn't been with me for months. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, playing back every moment from the past 6 months, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong when I had lost her. The next morning, I did what I knew I had to do. I called Ryan, the man who had torn apart my life. I found his number in Jessica's phone and saved it before I left the house. My fingers hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity, but I finally pressed call. It rang 3 times before he answered, his voice deep, casual, like he hadn't a care in the world. Hello? For a moment, I couldn't speak. Hearing his voice made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "This is Jake," I said, my voice cold. "Jessica's husband." There was silence on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head as he realized who I was. "Oh," he finally said. "Look, man, Don't look man me," I snapped. "I'm not calling to hear your excuses. I just want to know one thing. How long have you been screwing my wife?" Another pause, longer this time, as if he was trying to figure out what to say. "Look, Jake, I didn't know she was married at first, all right? She didn't tell me. I found out later, and by then, you didn't care," I finished for him. "Is that it?" His voice was quieter now, less confident. "It wasn't like that. I mean, yeah, I found out, but it just happened, man. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to get this far." I clenched my fist around the phone, barely able to contain my anger. 6 months, Ryan. 6 months you've been with her. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could just keep screwing her behind my back forever? Look, Jake, I know this is messed up, okay? I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't want to hurt anyone. The nerve of this guy. Acting like this was all just an accident, like he was some passive participant in the destruction of my marriage. "You didn't want to hurt anyone?" I repeated, my voice laced with venom. "Do you even know what you've done? Do you even care? You've ruined my life, my marriage." "Jake, I'm sorry, man," he said again, his voice almost pleading. If I'd known from the start, maybe things would have been different. The words hit me harder than I expected. Maybe things would have been different. Maybe if he hadn't met her, maybe if she hadn't responded, maybe if I hadn't been so blind. Maybe. But the damage was done, and there was no undoing it now. I hung up without another word, the sound of the call ending ringing in my ears. By the time I returned home, it was late. Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She didn't say anything as I walked in, didn't even look at me. She was a shell of the woman I once loved, hollowed out by guilt, by shame, by the weight of her own betrayal. I sat across from her, the silence stretching between us like a chasm too wide to cross. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "What happens now?" she whispered, her voice fragile, like she was afraid to hear the answer. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand that she pack her things and get out. But another part of me, one I hated, wanted to understand, to hear her side, to know why she had done this to us. So I asked the only question that had been burning in my mind since the moment I walked in on them. "Why, Jessica? Why him? Why did you do this?" She wiped at her eyes, her fingers trembling. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It just happened. I was lonely, Jake. You were always gone. You were always working. And I didn't know how to tell you that I needed more. That I needed you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had worked so hard to provide for us, to give her the life she wanted, and in the process, I had neglected the one thing that mattered most, her. "I didn't do this to hurt you," she continued, her voice thick with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you. I felt invisible." I sat there, staring at her, the woman I had loved for 7 years, the woman who had now become a stranger to me. Was this my fault? Had I pushed her into his arms? Or was that just another lie she was telling herself to justify what she'd done? I didn't have the answers. But one thing was certain. The life we had built together was gone. And there was no going back. For days, we existed in a strange, painful limbo. Jessica and I still lived in the same house, but we were like ghosts passing each other in the hallways, neither of us daring to speak the truth that hovered between us like an uninvited guest. The air was thick with unresolved tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on every moment. I would come home from work and find her sitting at the kitchen table, staring into the distance, her face pale and drained. She looked as though she hadn't slept in days, but then again, neither had I. Sleep was impossible with the memories of her betrayal constantly replaying in my mind. Their laughter, the phone calls, the messages. It haunted me, poisoned every quiet moment. The silence was unbearable, but I didn't know what to say. Every time I looked at her, I saw him. I saw her with someone else in our bed, sharing the intimacy that was supposed to be ours. And worse than the anger, worse than the pain, was the doubt. The gnawing uncertainty about whether any of this could ever be fixed. Then, one evening, she finally spoke. "I think we should talk," Jessica said softly, breaking the heavy silence between us. She sat at the edge of the couch, her hands nervously wringing together, her voice trembling. I stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, too drained to care anymore. I nodded, my chest tightening. "Yeah, I think we should." She took a deep breath, wiping at her eyes. "Jake, her voice faltered. "I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know how to make this right." I stared at her, trying to hold back the tidal wave of emotions that surged inside me. "Maybe you can't make it right," I said flatly. "Maybe there's nothing left to fix." Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, the sobs shaking her body. Normally, the sight of her in pain would have triggered something in me, compassion, sympathy, maybe even the desire to comfort her. But now, all I felt was a hollow emptiness. I couldn't reach for her. I couldn't offer her any solace because she had destroyed that part of me. She cried for what seemed like hours, and I let her. I didn't have it in me to say anything. I felt numb. Finally, when her tears had dried and her voice was hoarse, she looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. "What do you want, Jake? What do you need me to do?" I hadn't expected that question. It was as though she was surrendering, putting the decision in my hands. But that only made it harder. What did I want? Part of me wanted to yell at her, to pack my things and leave, to end this nightmare once and for all. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the love we once had, was holding on to a glimmer of hope, as fragile as it was. "I don't know," I finally admitted, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know what I want, Jessica." We sat in silence for a long time, the clock ticking in the background like a countdown to something inevitable. The truth was, I was lost. I didn't know how to move forward, how to rebuild something that had been so thoroughly shattered. But then Jessica said something I hadn't expected. "I'll leave," she whispered. "If that's what you want, I'll leave." I'll give you the space you need. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't even considered that she might leave, that she might walk away. And suddenly, the prospect of being alone, of losing her for good, was terrifying. As angry as I was, as betrayed as I felt, the thought of her not being in my life at all was unbearable. I didn't say anything for a long time, my mind spinning. Part of me wanted to let her go, to end this pain, to start over without the weight of her betrayal hanging over me. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, despite everything, was terrified of what that would mean. Could I really live without her? Did I even want to? I don't want you to leave, I finally said, my voice barely audible. Jessica's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of hope in her expression. But it was quickly replaced by doubt. Jake, I don't want to hurt you anymore. I don't know how to fix this. Maybe space is what we need. I shook my head, running a hand through my hair, frustrated with myself for not having clearer answers. I don't know if space will fix anything. I just know that if you walk out that door, it's over. There's no going back. The room was thick with tension, the weight of the decision pressing down on both of us. Jessica wiped her eyes again, her voice trembling. Do you still love me, Jake? It was the question I had been dreading, the one I didn't have an easy answer for. How could I love her after what she had done? How could I trust her again, knowing she had chosen someone else over me? But at the same time, how could I not love her? This woman had been my world for 7 years. Despite the lies, the betrayal, the pain, there was still a part of me that loved her. I don't know, I said honestly, my voice raw. I don't know if I can love you the way I used to, but I don't want to lose you. Not yet. Jessica's shoulders sagged with relief, and she nodded, her eyes filling with tears again. Then I'll stay. I'll do whatever it takes, Jake. I'll prove to you that I still love you, that I can be the wife you deserve. But could she? Could either of us really go back to what we had before? Or was it already too late, the damage irreparable? In the days that followed, Jessica threw herself into trying to win back my trust. She started cooking my favorite meals again, leaving little notes around the house like she used to, reminding me of the simpler, happier times when we were just Jake and Jessica, the couple who were in love and dreaming of a future together. But those small gestures, once sweet, now felt hollow. No amount of affection could erase the betrayal I had felt or the images of her with him. And yet, there was a part of me, ashamed as it was, that wanted to believe in her efforts. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could claw our way back to something that resembled the love we once had. But it wasn't easy. Every time she smiled at me, every time she touched me, the shadow of her affair loomed over us, tainting everything. I began to wonder if it was possible to forgive her, truly forgive her. Was it even worth it to try? Could we rebuild from the ashes of what was left? One evening, after another tense dinner, Jessica sat across from me, her face serious. I know this can't be fixed overnight, she said quietly, but I'm willing to go to therapy. Together, if you want. We need help, Jake. I can't do this alone. The idea of therapy felt foreign to me. We had always prided ourselves on being a couple that could work through anything on our own. But this wasn't something we could just talk our way through over a glass of wine. This was a wound that cut too deep, a scar that would never fully heal without help. I nodded slowly. Maybe that's what we need. Someone to help us figure out if there's anything left to save. Jessica's eyes filled with hope, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a glimpse of the woman I had fallen in love with. The woman I had shared my life with for 7 years. The woman I wasn't ready to give up on. Not completely. We'll find a way, she whispered, reaching across the table to take my hand. I let her, though the familiar warmth of her touch now felt foreign. Therapy sessions started soon after, and with them came a flood of painful admissions. Each meeting was an exhausting exploration of the raw wounds in our relationship. Jessica was honest, painfully so, about the affair, how it started, how it progressed, how she felt lost and disconnected. Hearing it from her in that sterile room, with a stranger nodding sympathetically, made it all the more real. But it wasn't just her betrayal that came to light. Our counselor, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Mallory, was quick to dig into the cracks that had formed in our marriage long before Jessica met Ryan. The late nights, the emotional distance, my obsession with work. It was hard to hear that I wasn't just the victim in this story. I had contributed to the fracture between us. And that realization cut deep. Affairs don't just happen, Dr. Mallory said one session, her gaze shifting between us. They're a symptom of deeper issues, issues that both partners need to address if there's any hope of healing. Jessica squeezed my hand, her eyes pleading for understanding. And while part of me wanted to lash out, to tell her this was her fault, I knew deep down that there was truth in Dr. Mallory's words. But knowing that didn't make it easier. Weeks passed. Jessica and I attended therapy regularly, navigating the wreckage of our marriage with careful, tentative steps. Each session felt like pulling a scab from a wound that was barely beginning to heal. There was progress. Some days we talked more openly, laughed even, but other days it felt like we were drowning under the weight of everything left unsaid. I noticed the little things first. How she made coffee for me every morning now, the way she lingered longer in conversation, listening more attentively than before. I saw her trying, really trying, but no matter how hard she worked to rebuild the foundation we once had, I couldn't help but feel that our relationship was like a fragile vase, shattered and glued back together. The cracks were still visible, and I wondered if it would ever be whole again. One evening, after a particularly draining session with Dr. Mallory, Jessica sat beside me on the couch, her body angled toward me but unsure, like she was afraid of crossing some invisible line. "Do you think we're getting anywhere?" she asked, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. "Do you think this can work?" I stared at her for a moment, my mind racing with conflicting emotions. There were days when I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. But there were also days when the betrayal weighed too heavily, like an anchor pulling me down into a sea of resentment. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice low. "Some days, I think we can. Other days, I'm not so sure." Jessica nodded, her eyes downcast. "I get it," she whispered. "I know I've hurt you, Jake. I don't expect this to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I hope you still believe we're worth fighting for." Her words hung in the air, a question unspoken. Did I believe that? Was this marriage still worth saving? "I want to believe that," I said after a long pause. "I do, but it's going to take time. Trust doesn't come back overnight." "I know," she murmured, "and I'm prepared for that. I just don't want to lose you." We sat in silence after that, the weight of the conversation settling over us like a thick fog. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to close the distance between us and take her hand. But another part of me still recoiled, remembering the months of lies, the hidden phone, the messages to him. The betrayal had cut so deeply that even moments like this, moments of vulnerability and honesty, felt tainted. A few more weeks passed, and while Jessica was focused on proving her loyalty and commitment, I found myself in a different kind of turmoil. The anger had begun to dull, replaced by an overwhelming need for clarity. I wanted answers, answers that therapy could only partially provide. I couldn't shake the lingering questions that haunted me every night. How often had she seen him? What had she told him about me? What did their relationship really mean to her? It wasn't closure I needed. It was control. Control over the narrative of my life that had been so brutally taken from me when I discovered the affair. So, one night, when Jessica was asleep, I found myself staring at her phone again. I knew I shouldn't. I knew Dr. Mallory had advised against obsessing over the details, warning that it could derail any progress we were making. But my fingers itched to know. I needed to see it, to understand the full scope of what had happened. Quietly, I unlocked her phone, using the password I now knew, and scrolled through her messages. There were no new ones from him, of course. She had promised to cut all ties, and I believed her. But it wasn't the present that I was concerned about, it was the past. I went back, months back, to when it all started. The first messages between them were painfully casual, like the beginnings of a friendship. But as I scrolled further, I saw how it changed. How the banter grew more intimate, more flirty, until it was unmistakably something more. "Ryan, you looked beautiful today. Can't wait to see you again. Same time tomorrow?" Jessica, you always know how to make me smile. Tomorrow sounds perfect. A knot formed in my stomach. My breath caught as I kept scrolling, reading more, seeing how she had fallen into his orbit. They spoke about me sometimes. How distant I was. How busy. Excuses. Justifications. And then I saw it. The first explicit message. Ryan, last night was incredible. I haven't stopped thinking about you. Jessica, it felt so good to be with you. You make me feel alive. I dropped the phone like it burned me. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the counter as the air felt like it had been sucked from the room. I had been bracing for this, but nothing could have prepared me for the visceral pain that surged through me at that moment. It was one thing to know she had cheated. It was another to read it, to see it spelled out so blatantly, so cruelly. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the storm raging inside me. I wanted to confront her, to demand she explain every single message, every moment she had chosen him over me. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to hear any more. The next morning, Jessica noticed the change in me. She could sense the distance, the tension, even though I tried to hide it. But I couldn't look at her the same way. The words from the night before echoed in my head, twisting the knife in deeper. At breakfast, she set a plate down in front of me, her usual soft smile on her lips. But I didn't respond. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on my coffee, fighting the urge to explode, to unleash everything that had been simmering inside me. Jake, she asked quietly, sitting down across from me. Are you okay? I glanced up at her, my jaw tight. I looked through your phone, I said flatly. Her face went pale, and she froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. What did you see? You know what I saw, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and she set the fork down slowly. Jake, I told you. I cut things off. It's over. That was all before. Before what? I interrupted, my voice rising. Before I found out? Before you decided I wasn't worth the truth? Before you destroyed everything? She flinched at the harshness of my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I never wanted to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I laughed bitterly, pushing my chair back and standing up. Well, congratulations, Jessica. You did. You hurt me more than you could possibly imagine. You shattered everything we had. She sobbed openly now, her hands covering her face. Please, Jake. I'm trying. I'm doing everything I can to fix this. Maybe it's not enough, I snapped, my anger finally breaking free. Maybe nothing will ever be enough. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. I hadn't meant to say it, but once they were out, I couldn't take them back. Jessica looked up at me, her face drenched in tears, her eyes wide with fear. Are you saying it's over? She whispered, her voice trembling. I stared at her, my chest heaving with the weight of everything unsaid, every emotion I had been holding back. I didn't know how to answer. The truth was, I didn't know if it was over. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, if I could ever move past what she had done. But I wasn't ready to make that decision. Not yet. I don't know, I said finally, my voice hollow. I don't know what's left. And with that, I walked out of the house, leaving Jessica sobbing at the table. I drove aimlessly for hours, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away, to breathe, to think. The walls of our home, once a place of love and comfort, now felt suffocating. Every corner, every room, was tainted by the memory of her betrayal. I found myself at the edge of a cliff, overlooking the ocean. The wind whipped around me, the sound of the crashing waves drowning out the storm in my mind. I stood there, staring out at the vast expanse of water, feeling as though I was standing on the edge of my own life, teetering between two worlds, the one I had known and the one I was now facing. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to let go, to walk away from everything. Jessica, our marriage, the life we had built. But another part of me was terrified of what that would mean. Could I really start over? Could I really walk away from the woman I had loved for so long? The questions swirled in my mind, unanswered, as I stood there, watching the horizon darken with the setting sun. I was lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back. I stayed at the cliffside until the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving me in near total darkness. The wind was harsh, biting through my jacket, but it was nothing compared to the cold gnawing at my insides. I had always believed in second chances, that people could change, that mistakes could be forgiven if the love was strong enough. But now, standing there on the precipice of my life, I wasn't sure anymore. Was love enough to heal a wound this deep? I thought about the years Jessica and I had spent together, building our lives, our home, our memories. There were so many good moments, so much happiness, and yet it all felt tainted now, like every smile, every kiss, every "I love you" had been nothing but a lie. But maybe, just maybe, those good memories were worth fighting for. Maybe, beneath the betrayal, there was something still worth saving. By the time I got back to the house, it was close to midnight. The house was dark except for a single light coming from the living room. I walked in, my steps heavy, and found Jessica sitting on the couch, curled up with a blanket around her. She looked up when I entered, her face streaked with tears. Her eyes were red, swollen, and filled with an exhaustion that matched my own. "You're back," she whispered, her voice shaky. It wasn't a question. It was more like a statement of disbelief, as if she hadn't expected me to return. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. The anger had subsided, replaced by something quieter, more painful, an ache that lingered deep in my chest. I didn't know what to say to her. I didn't even know what I felt anymore. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. "I thought you'd left for good," she continued, her voice small. She looked fragile, broken, and as much as I hated to admit it, I still cared. Seeing her like this, vulnerable and hurting, reminded me of the woman I fell in love with, the woman I had spent 7 years building a life with. I sat down in the armchair across from her, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing how to bridge the gap that had grown between us. The distance felt insurmountable, and yet, here we were, still in the same room, still tethered by something neither of us fully understood. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, I know I've said it 100 times, but I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you like this." I stared at the floor, my hands clasped tightly together. "I believe you," I said, my voice low. "But you did." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. "I know, and I can't take it back. But I'm trying, Jake. I'm trying so hard to make things right." I looked up at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen before, genuine remorse. It wasn't just guilt or fear of losing me. It was the look of someone who knew they had destroyed something precious and didn't know how to put the pieces back together. But I didn't know if I could let her in again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of the words. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you and not see him. Every time I think about what you did, it feels like it's happening all over again." She let out a quiet sob, clutching the blanket tighter around her. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm not asking for you to forgive me all at once. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm still the woman you married, that I still love you, Jake." I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes for a moment, letting her words wash over me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that love was enough to fix this. But the wound was too fresh, too raw. Could time really heal something so deeply broken? "I don't know if love is enough anymore," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what love means after this." Jessica was quiet for a long time, her sobs subsiding into soft, uneven breaths. Finally, she wiped her eyes, her voice steady for the first time in days. "I'll wait," she said simply. "I'll wait as long as it takes, Jake. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, and I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. But I'll wait, and I'll prove to you that I'm not giving up on us. Not ever." Her words hung in the air between us, heavy with both promise and uncertainty. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because in that moment, I didn't know if I had it in me to wait, to rebuild, to find the pieces of myself that had been shattered. All I knew was that I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. The following weeks were strange, a mix of tentative steps forward and painful reminders of the past. Jessica and I continued with therapy, but the sessions felt different now. There was no more anger in our voices, no more shouting. Instead, there was just the quiet, aching sadness of two people trying to figure out if they could salvage something from the wreckage. Dr. Mallory had us focus on rebuilding trust, but it felt impossible at times. Trust had been the foundation of our marriage, and now it was gone, reduced to rubble. How do you rebuild something that had been so thoroughly destroyed? One afternoon, during a particularly difficult session, Dr. Mallory asked us both a simple question. What do you need from each other to move forward? Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. I need Jake to believe that I still love him, she said softly. I need him to know that, despite everything, my love for him never changed. And I need him to give me a chance to prove that I can be the wife he deserves. Dr. Mallory nodded, then turned to me. And you, Jake? What do you need? I hesitated, unsure of how to put my thoughts into words. What did I need? Did I even know anymore? Finally, I spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. I need time, I said. I need time to figure out if I can trust her again. I need space to heal. And I need her to understand that this isn't something I can just get over. It's going to take a long time, and I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive her. Jessica's face fell at my words, but she didn't argue. She nodded, accepting the reality of the situation. And for the first time, I saw a glimmer of hope. Not because things were magically better, but because we were finally being honest with each other. 2 months later, things between Jessica and me were stable. Not healed, not back to normal, but there was a fragile understanding between us now. We had good days where we would laugh or talk like we used to, and we had bad days where the weight of the past was too much for either of us to bear. It was a slow, painful process, but it was progress. Then came the unexpected call. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, expecting a work email or a spam call, but when I saw the name on the screen, my heart stopped. Ryan. Jessica saw the look on my face, and her expression immediately darkened. Who is it? She asked, her voice tight. I swallowed hard, showing her the screen. Her eyes widened in horror, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Why is he calling you? She whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I replied, staring at the phone as if it were some kind of bomb waiting to go off. I debated whether to answer it or not. A part of me wanted nothing more than to ignore it, to delete his number and pretend like this was all just a bad dream. But another part of me, the part that still wanted answers, still craved closure, told me to pick up. With a deep breath, I answered the call. Jake, Ryan's voice came through the phone, and just hearing it made my skin crawl. I know this is probably the last thing you want, but I need to talk to you. I felt Jessica's eyes on me, her face a mix of panic and fear. I walked out of the kitchen, stepping onto the porch, needing distance from her, needing space to handle this. What do you want? I asked, my voice cold. Ryan sighed, and I could hear the guilt in his tone. I wanted to apologize, he said, for everything, for what I did to you, to your marriage. I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I know I screwed up. I know I was wrong. His words meant nothing to me. Not anymore. You think an apology fixes this? I spat. Do you think telling me you're sorry erases the fact that you destroyed my marriage? I know it doesn't, Ryan replied, his voice quiet. I'm not looking for forgiveness, Jake. I needed to say it. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry, and that if I could take it back, I would. There was a long pause, the silence between us heavy with all the things that could never be unsaid. Is that all? I asked, my voice barely masking my anger. Yeah, he said after a moment. That's all. I'm sorry, Jake, for everything. I hung up the phone without another word. As I stood there on the porch, staring out into the dark night, I realized something. Ryan's apology didn't matter. It wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't undo the betrayal or the months of lies. But what mattered was what happened next, what I chose to do with the pieces of my life that were still left. And as I walked back into the house, I knew that I was the one who would decide the future, not Ryan, not Jessica. Me. I stood on the porch, staring into the darkness, trying to process everything. Ryan's words echoed in my head, and despite my anger, there was a strange sense of closure creeping in. It wasn't forgiveness, far from it, but it felt like a chapter had finally closed. His apology, however meaningless it was, marked an end to his role in my life. The real question was whether Jessica and I could move forward from here. Could I even look at her the same way again, knowing everything that had happened? When I stepped back into the house, Jessica was standing in the kitchen, waiting for me. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body tense, as if bracing for some terrible news. The silence between us stretched, and I could see the question in her eyes. What did he say? I didn't make her wait long. He apologized, I said flatly, placing my phone on the counter. Jessica let out a small, shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as if she had been holding them up for hours. I'm so sorry, Jake. I had no idea he would contact you. I haven't spoken to him since. I know, I interrupted. I believe you. Her eyes met mine, filled with something that looked like hope, but I wasn't ready to let her off that easily. The apology might have closed a chapter, but there was still the matter of us, our broken, fragile relationship. I don't know where to go from here, I admitted, running a hand through my hair. This has all been too much. I thought after his apology, I'd feel some kind of peace, but it didn't change anything. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding. I don't expect you to forgive me because of that. I don't expect you to wake up tomorrow and feel any different. I know this is a long process, Jake. I know I'm the one who caused all of this pain, but I'm still here. I'm still fighting for us. I watched her closely, my heart a storm of conflicting emotions. There was a time when hearing her say that would have made me feel secure, would have reassured me that we could weather anything. But now, all I felt was the cold reality that we might never be the same again. But as I looked at her, the tears still brimming in her eyes, I knew I couldn't just walk away. Not yet. I'm not leaving, I said, my voice heavy with the weight of the decision. But I need time, Jessica. I need more time to figure this out. To figure us out. She nodded, relief flooding her face. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. Days turned into weeks, and we continued the delicate balancing act that had become our life. Jessica and I had slipped into a strange routine, one that felt both comfortable and painful at the same time. We spoke more openly than we had before, and our therapy sessions were still ongoing, but the shadows of the affair lingered like a ghost neither of us could shake. I was doing my best to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, but it wasn't easy. Every time she went out, every time her phone buzzed, there was a part of me that flinched, wondering if she was lying again. I hated that feeling, hated that I had been reduced to this suspicious, paranoid version of myself. And yet, Jessica was patient. She answered every question, never shying away from the tough conversations. She volunteered information, over-communicated, and did everything in her power to prove that she was committed to our marriage. But even with all her efforts, there were days when the anger returned, days when I couldn't even look at her without remembering the messages, the lies, the way she had looked with him. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, Jessica surprised me with a suggestion. I think we need to get away, she said, breaking the silence as she pushed her plate aside. I looked up at her, surprised. Get away? Where? Anywhere, she said softly. Just us. A place where we can be away from everything. This house, the therapy sessions, the memories. I think we need a fresh start, just for a few days, to clear our heads. I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The idea of leaving felt overwhelming. There was so much unresolved between us, so many layers of hurt still to peel back. But at the same time, maybe that was exactly what we needed, distance from the place where everything had fallen apart. A chance to remember why we were fighting for this marriage in the first place. Where would we go? I asked after a long pause. Jessica smiled, just slightly. I've been looking at a small cabin a couple hours away. It's quiet, secluded. It's a place where we can just be us. There was something in her eyes that made me pause. A kind of desperation. She was reaching for me, trying to pull me back from the edge where I had been teetering for months. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that she was just as scared as I was. Scared of losing everything, scared of what came next. "I'll think about it," I said finally, my voice soft. "But maybe that's what we need." Jessica nodded, her relief palpable. "Take your time. I'll book it only if you're ready." It took me a few days, but eventually, I agreed to the trip. I wasn't entirely sure it was the right move, but something told me that we needed this. A break from the constant pressure, the questions, the relentless weight of the past. The cabin was a small, rustic place nestled deep in the woods. It was the kind of spot that felt like it belonged in another world, far removed from the chaos of our everyday lives. As we pulled up, I couldn't help but feel a small flicker of hope, as if this could be the beginning of something new. A chance to breathe again. Jessica seemed different here, too. Lighter, maybe. We unpacked our things and spent the first evening sitting outside on the porch, watching the stars. There was a kind of quiet between us that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt like we were both slowly exhaling after holding our breath for far too long. "I miss this," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Just being with you. No distractions. No noise." I glanced over at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with. Not the woman who had lied, not the woman who had betrayed me, but the woman who had once been my best friend, my partner in everything. "I missed it too," I admitted, my voice low. We didn't say much more that night, but something shifted between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. A small step toward the possibility that maybe we could find our way back to each other. The next day, we decided to take a hike through the woods surrounding the cabin. The air was crisp, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. As we walked, Jessica and I fell into easy conversation, reminiscing about the early days of our relationship, the trips we used to take, the dreams we once had. It felt good, like we were reconnecting, rediscovering the parts of ourselves that had been lost in the chaos of the affair. But as the conversation deepened, so did the weight of the unresolved issues between us. Halfway through the hike, we stopped by a small stream, sitting down on a fallen log to catch our breath. The sound of the water was soothing, but my mind was already drifting to darker places. "I need to ask you something," I said quietly, my gaze fixed on the rushing water. Jessica turned to me, her expression tense. "Of course. Ask me anything." I hesitated, knowing that this conversation would open old wounds, but I couldn't keep it bottled up any longer. When it was happening with Ryan, did you ever think about me? About us?" Her face crumpled, and she looked away, her voice trembling when she spoke. "Every day," she whispered. "Every single day, Jake. I knew I was making a terrible mistake. I knew I was hurting you, even though you didn't know it. And it killed me. But I was selfish. I didn't stop. I couldn't." Her words sliced through me, raw and painful. But at the same time, there was something liberating about hearing her admit it, about knowing that she had struggled too, that I hadn't just been a fool left in the dark. "I hated myself for it," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew I was destroying us, but I didn't know how to stop. And the more I lied, the deeper I fell." I stared at her, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to process the flood of feelings crashing over me. But what I did know was that, for the first time, she was being completely honest. No excuses, no justifications, just the brutal truth. "I need you to understand something," she said, turning back to face me. "I never stopped loving you. Even when I was at my worst, even when I was lying to you. I never stopped loving you. I lost myself." I looked at her, and for a brief moment, I saw her vulnerability. The guilt, the shame, the regret. It was all laid bare, and it wasn't for me to fix. This was her burden to carry, and I could see that she was carrying it every single day. "I believe you," I said quietly, surprising even myself. "But it's going to take more than words." Jessica nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if I have to. The rest of our trip was a mix of moments, some light and easy, some heavy with the weight of what still lay between us. But for the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. On the last night, as we sat by the fire, Jessica took my hand. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. I looked at her, and for the first time, I saw a future. A future that wasn't perfect, that wasn't free from pain, but one that we might be able to build together again. I don't know what the future holds, I said quietly, squeezing her hand, but I'm willing to try. Jessica smiled through her tears, her grip tightening around mine. That's all I've ever wanted, Jake. A chance to try. The drive back from the cabin was quiet, but not in a bad way. There was a peacefulness that hadn't existed between us for months. While we weren't healed, not by a long shot, we had found a small patch of solid ground amid the chaos. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. As the city skyline came into view, the weight of reality began to press down again. It wasn't the same as it had been before the cabin, but the tension was still there, lingering just below the surface. There was no escaping the fact that we still had a long way to go. We couldn't just leave the hurt behind in the woods. It would follow us back to our house, back to our routine. But something had shifted. Jessica glanced over at me as we exited the freeway, her hand resting lightly on my knee. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked, her voice tentative, like she was afraid to hope. I kept my eyes on the road, turning her question over in my mind. "I think we have a chance," I replied after a long pause. "But it's going to take time, and I'm not going to pretend like it won't be hard. This isn't something that just disappears." She nodded, understanding. "I don't expect it to," she said quietly. "I just want us to keep trying." I turned onto our street, and as we pulled into the driveway, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Coming home should have felt comforting, but instead, it felt like walking back into a minefield. One wrong step, and everything could blow up again. As we stepped through the front door, the familiar smells and sounds of our house washed over me, but they felt different now. Every corner, every room, held the echoes of what had happened, the memories of the months of lies and betrayal. I knew it wouldn't be easy to reclaim this space, to make it feel like home again. Jessica must have sensed my hesitation because she gently touched my arm. "Maybe we could make some changes," she suggested. "Redecorate a little. I don't know. Maybe it would help if things felt new." It was a small gesture, but the idea sparked something in me. Changing the environment, even slightly, could help shift the energy in the house. Make it feel like a fresh start instead of a constant reminder of the pain. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "That could be good." Over the next few weeks, Jessica and I threw ourselves into the task of making the house feel new again. It wasn't just about painting walls or rearranging furniture. It was about reclaiming the space that had become a battlefield of our emotions. We worked side by side, choosing new colors, moving things around, making small but significant changes that helped breathe new life into the place. During this time, we talked more. Sometimes it was about the betrayal, but more often it was about mundane things. The kind of conversations we used to have before everything fell apart. There was a sense of ease growing between us, like we were slowly finding our rhythm again. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, after we had finished painting the living room, we sat on the floor, exhausted but proud of our work. Jessica leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. It was the first time in months that we had shared such easy, quiet intimacy. "I like this," she said softly. "Just being with you." I looked down at her, my heart heavy with both love and uncertainty. "I like it too," I admitted. But even in that moment of calm, there was still the nagging question of whether we could fully recover, whether I could truly forgive her. Therapy continued, and while we were making progress, there was still a question I hadn't been able to answer. Dr. Mallory had pushed us both to confront the core issue: trust. Could I ever trust Jessica again? Could I ever look at her and not see the lies, the affair, the betrayal? One session, Dr. Mallory asked the question I had been avoiding for months. "Jake, do you think you can forgive Jessica? Truly forgive her?" The room went quiet. Jessica's eyes locked onto mine, waiting for my answer. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice shaky. "I want to. I really do. But every time I think I'm getting close, something pulls me back. It's like I can't stop thinking about it. What she did, who she was with." Jessica's face fell, but she didn't interrupt. She had learned to give me the space I needed to process, even if it hurt to hear. Dr. Mallory leaned forward, her gaze gentle but firm. "Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight, Jake. It's a process. It's something you have to choose every day. But you can't move forward if you're still holding on to the past." I nodded, understanding but still feeling the weight of the past pressing down on me. "I'm trying," I said quietly. "I just don't know how to let go." The weeks turned into months, and gradually, the rawness of the betrayal began to fade. It was still there, lingering in the background, but it didn't dominate every conversation, every thought. Jessica and I had begun to find a new normal, a routine that worked for us, a way to be together without the constant tension hanging over us. There were moments when the pain resurfaced, moments when I would catch her looking at her phone and feel a pang of suspicion, but each time, I reminded myself that we were rebuilding, that trust wasn't something that could be restored overnight. Jessica was patient. She understood that it would take time, and she never pushed me to move faster than I was ready. And in return, I did my best to give her the benefit of the doubt, to believe that she was committed to making things right. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jessica took my hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so long, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We were healing, slowly but surely. "I think we're going to be okay," I said quietly, squeezing her hand in return. "It's going to take time, but we're getting there." Jessica smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'm glad," she whispered. "I love you, Jake." "I love you too," I replied, the words coming more easily now. The months passed, and with each passing day, the distance between us shrank. It wasn't an easy road. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, moments when the old wounds reopened, but Jessica and I had learned how to talk through it, how to face the pain together instead of letting it tear us apart. There were still moments when the past haunted me, when I would remember the messages I had found, or the nights I spent alone while she was with him. But those moments were fewer now, and they didn't consume me like they once did. We took things one day at a time. Trust wasn't something that could be forced or rushed. It had to be earned. And every day, Jessica showed me that she was committed to earning it, to rebuilding what we had lost. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But we were stronger now. The cracks in our relationship were still visible, but they were no longer the focal point. We were learning to fill them in, to build something new on top of the broken pieces. One night, as we lay in bed, I found myself thinking about everything we had been through. The affair, the lies, the months of pain. It had been the hardest thing I had ever faced, and yet, here we were, still together, still trying. Jessica was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the sharp sting of betrayal. Instead, I felt something different, something softer. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had begun to forgive her. It wasn't a sudden thing, not a single moment of clarity. It had happened gradually, over time, as we rebuilt our lives together. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. I would never forget, but I had learned to let go of the anger, the bitterness. I had learned to move forward. And in that moment, lying beside the woman I had loved for so long, I knew that we were going to be okay. The next morning, as we sat together drinking coffee, I reached across the table and took Jessica's hand in mine. She looked up at me, surprised, her eyes questioning. "I forgive you," I said softly, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, her breath catching in her throat. "Jake, I'm not saying everything's perfect," I continued, "and I'm not saying we're done healing. But I forgive you, Jessica, and I'm ready to move forward." She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes wide with emotion. Then she squeezed my hand, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. I smiled, feeling a weight lift from my chest. "I love you," I said simply, "and I'm ready to start again." Jessica and I still had a long road ahead of us, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. We had been through hell and back, but we were still standing. We were still fighting. And as we moved forward, I realized that while the past would always be a part of our story, it didn't have to define us. We could build something new, something stronger, something better. Our future wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that was enough. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.